So, coexistence, contamination, the organic movement. I was intrigued about the dates, you know, the first phase of '97 that you picked, because the issue of GM and the organic movement actually goes back quite a bit before that. And I'll just go through some of that because it's very relevant to the current period that we're in. It may surprise many of you, or some of you, to know that the organic movement was very split on the issue of genetic engineering. In the late 80s, early 90s, a surprising number of people were very willing to support GM as a method that could develop and could be beneficial to organic agriculture. And there was some very robust is the polite word, putting it, of pressure and arguments that went on internally. Not much of this came out externally, but the Soil Association, for example, took a long time before it came out with an anti-GM position. The international organic movement also took a long time. And as I said, there was quite a bit of internal fighting before those organisations were prevailed upon to take an anti-GM stance. My organisation, which at that time was called Elm Farm Research Centre, it's now called the Organic Research Centre, was very much at the forefront of this internal fight and battle. The thing internationally became resolved in 1998 when the International Organic Movement had a conference in Argentina and issued a declaration that said GM has got no place in organic agriculture. But in fact, before that, in the UK, we'd already made some grounds on that, and a body which was called UK Register of Organic Food Standards, which was set up by government but had parliamentary status. Our remit was actually to report to Parliament, the Minister and Parliament, which was very useful later on. And that was created in 1987, but by 1990, can't find the date, it doesn't matter, but by 1995, the UCROFS board, which consisted of researchers, some people from the business establishment, Food Standards Agency, as well as organic people, also issued a statement saying GM has no place in organic agriculture. Now remember that this is the government-backed, there's an organisation, an establishment organisation in 1995, being absolutely clear that GM has got no place in organic agriculture. The reason we made a big thing and had to do that was because of the arguments within organic agriculture, within a number of farmers who were saying, you can't stop us using these tools. We might be able to have nitrogen fixing wheat, you know, the folly and the imagination, the fanciful idea still goes on, you know. So how can you start, if that can happen, that's good for organic farming, good for low input farming, and so on and so on. GM might help us speed up organic plant breeding, because we didn't have a definition of organic plant breeding in those days. So anyway, that kind of stuff was there. Even then, people were talking about blight-resistant potatoes or treatment of blight in potatoes and whether GM could help with that. But that kind of stuff was eventually won, but those arguments didn't entirely go away and were rather taken up by other people who called themselves low input or sustainable farmers. There was this group in America I called a two-faced whore, because it stood for LISA, which was low input sustainable agriculture. LISA, you know, what it was just a bloody device to get the worst of conventional agriculture into kind of organic system. But we kind of won that, except that in the organic regulation, the UK standards and then the organic regulation, we lost the argument on certain enzymes and we lost big on vaccines. So actually enzymes produced through genetically engineered organisms can be used in organic agriculture legally, and vaccines, again produced from material that's been genetically engineered, can be used. Now, why did we lose on this? That's because of our ignorance and because of the lack of support from science. One of the problems with the organic movement is, we're trying to do too many things on too many fronts. And we did not have sufficient skill or sufficient knowledge to argue those particular points. We were faced with what turns out to be industry-backed animal researchers who just absolutely declared that certain classes of vaccines could not be produced anymore without genetically engineered enzymes and genetically engineered material. And we didn't have the knowledge or whatever to challenge that. The counter-argument, which is one I put, didn't get very far, which was, okay, but the technology to produce vaccines isn't that great, actually. It's not, we should produce a completely separate supply chain. So we can ring-fence organic agriculture. And, but nobody wanted to make that investment. So in fact, what's happened is the growth of the organic sector, particularly in animal treatments, vaccines, processing, and the management of the supply chain, has these interactions and crossovers and dangers of contamination because it's very close to the conventional industry. Now, so far, that is a problem, but it's not a huge problem. It is a problem because the supply chain does get contaminated. It's not a huge problem because particularly the amount of crops grown genetically, GM crops grown, is actually very small. So it hasn't had a massive impact on the supply chain in Europe and the UK. That is about to change, or could change, with the advent of these new genetic engineering techniques and the availability, therefore, of a whole new range of crops, which brings in the problem and the issue of where we are with coexistence and contamination. The UK and Europe has a policy of coexistence. Policymakers will tell you, whether in Westminster or whether in Brussels, will tell you, we're not pro-GM, we're not anti-organic, we're not pro-anything. We believe there should be choice. There should be a conventional sector, a GM sector if they want, and there should be an organic sector. And we, policymakers, will make it possible for all those things to happen. Of course, yeah, I mean, let's say theoretically that would be possible. But putting the steps in to make that actually happen are very difficult. And of course, whether you can ever have coexistence in reality is a very moot point. But from the very beginning, the policymakers have lied, as have the researchers, about the possibility of contamination. Not all researchers, actually. We collaborated, On-Farm Research Centre collaborated with the John Innes Centre on a report way back in the 90s on the threat to organic agriculture from genetic engineering and from gene flow. And all the researchers involved in that were absolutely clear. Basically, you can't guarantee zero. So the issue is to decide, this is the John Innes researchers' position, the issue is to decide what level of contamination of organic crops from GM is acceptable. Our position was obviously different, that we really can do better, we must do better, and that in fact led to a very surprising declaration, a letter from this establishment board, UCROFS, in 1999, where the UCROFS board wrote to the Minister and its report to Parliament, called for a moratorium of commercial planting of all GM in the UK until controls of gene flow and contamination could be dealt with and the proper regulations put in place. 1999, essentially a government body making that recommendation because of this question about contamination. Now, we have no coexistence policy in the EU. The only thing the EU has at the moment is a very poorly drafted guidance note, which just said you've got to have coexistence. You've got to have coexistence measures in place. They never specified what that should be. It has no legal weight, and so on. Different countries have got some coexistence measures in place. Denmark, for example, has on the statute book got a very detailed coexistence procedure in place with clear liabilities. It's never been challenged in court yet. Germany have got something on the statute book that places liability clearly on the user, but that's never been tested in court. And we in the UK have nothing. The debate about what measures of coexistence should be, what the coexistence measures should be, ended in somewhere around early 2000 and has never been picked up since, so we've never really talked about it. But what we know is, and what is clear, and these are battles that are important, we may not have lost so far, but and they will pick up. One is, what is contamination? And the European regulation allows a threshold value of 0.9% of GM material, up to the threshold for 0.9% threshold for accidental and adventitious causes. So material that has basically come in by accident that couldn't be prevented. A threshold of 0.9%. In fact, what's happened is all politicians, all policymakers, all researchers now regard that and have done all their research, and the policy push has been that 0.9% is now the base. Actually, if you read the regulation, 0 is the base. If there's an accident, that's up to 0.9%. But now 0.9% is the base. If you're devising coexistence measures for whichever crop it is, this makes a very big difference about the contamination distances, about the pollen flow distances. If you've got 0, obviously it's much tighter. If you've got 0.9% as the base, the allowable, the theoretical pollen spread or gene flow different areas become much tighter, much more difficult for farmers in the industry. The other thing that came in, there's a battle about it, and then it's, I thought we'd won, it then disappeared, but it's still lurking around, is the amount of GM contamination in seed. Now all seed regulations demand that seed is clean, it's pure and it's clean, but obviously perfection is not a thing possible in the real world. So they do allow a degree of admixture in any kind of seed lot. But they added the proposal for GM between 0.5% and 0.3%, depending on the, I can't remember now, I think it was 0.3% for maize and 0.5% for something else, I can't remember which, but 0.3 and 0.5%. GM contamination allowed in seed lots. Now this is not on the statute book yet, but this is the proposal. So if you have, and that would mean seed could have up to 0.5% GM contamination, not labelled. So, you know, you start selling seed, people go buy GM seed and you have no idea what you're buying. So you can't put measures in place. So that's still there. So that if we pick up again the coexistence debate, we've got to fight the battle about 0.9% generally and these contamination levels in seed. Where it's now a critical point is it hasn't mattered so much because Europe hasn't grown the crops. And as far as the UK is concerned, and also many other European farmers, the crops that's available doesn't make any difference to farmers. I said earlier, you know, the cabinet office policy unit came to a clear conclusion that there was no commercial basis for GM cropping in the UK, and you could say also for most of Europe. It's because of the crops available. Nothing that's on the market is of great interest to any farmer in terms of making money. I think fodder beet might have been at one point, but who the hell wants to grow fodder beet? It's not really a big deal. But the onset of the new genetic engineering technologies, and I know at the moment, for the next 5 years, there's nothing much in the pipeline, but things will speed up with these new genetic engineering technologies. And with the onset of those, even if those are labelled GM technologies and have to be fall under the GM regulation and have to be labelled, we've still got this contamination problem of 0.9 and 0.3 and so on. Better, anyway, obviously, clearly it's better that we do make sure that they are labelled GM. And that's the big threat. We've won a battle at the moment, because my horror was that crops coming along, like Roundup resistant wheat or Roundup resistant grass seed, those kinds of crops will make a big impact on UK agriculture, and farmers will want to grow those. The holding back the license or giving the license for glyphosate for 5 years is a major victory in that regard. That takes away that worry. Yeah, so because the weight of pollen, it's not just the field distances, it's the weight of pollen flow in any area. So if you get a lot of fields together in a particular region, it's simply the weight of pollen that makes the contamination more likely. So that's a threat. Now, in going back to final point, this is the real worry. The conversations that we had in the organic movement back in the late in the 80s and 90s about whether or not genetic engineering techniques should be allowed in organic agriculture have now started again. Why can't we have cisgenesis? Because even though there's blight-resistant potatoes around, actually they're not necessarily commercially great, whatever. Why can't we have it same species? Most people polled in Holland, a large percentage of people in the UK, and a number of farmers all over the place actually are in favour of cisgenesis, and even its use in organic agriculture. The arguments are again starting about the use of the new genetic engineering techniques, particularly CRISPR, as to because you're not adding, because they believe, and I know Michael's going to say, the belief that you're not putting any GM material into that when you use CRISPR is not true. It's nonetheless, that narrative is winning, and they say, okay, CRISPR is just, it's getting the internal structures of DNA to repair themselves. So isn't this in line with organic? So we're now having this kind of argument again. So we're coming around in full circles and have to win all that battle again.
Thank you.